I'm going to change the sermon that I was going to do, and I want to just look at Matthew chapter 2 instead this morning, instead of the Genesis passage that we were going to look at. So Matthew chapter 2, and if you have your scriptures, you might want to follow along as we're going to look at the story of the wise men. And today is Epiphany, and Epiphany is the day in the church calendar where we celebrate the coming of the wise men when they made their appearance at Bethlehem. And so here's the story. It says, in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men, or Magi, from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophets. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men, and he learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and they paid him homage. And then opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. And he sent and he killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." And then Joseph got up and he took the child and his mother, and they went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. I want to look at 3 kings today, except the 3 kings that we're going to look at are not just the 3 Magi. I want to look at King Herod, the Magi as a group, and then Jesus. Now, there is a strange irony here that in the same sentence that we have the mention of the birth of Jesus, that we have the mention of King Herod. King Herod this is Herod the Great, and there are several Herods in the scriptures, but Herod the Great. Herod the Great was a fascinating character in that his father was a collaborator with the Romans when the Romans came into Israel. And so then the Romans made this Herod one of the rulers in Israel. And then when he died, he had three sons, one of which, of course, is Herod the Great, and he was going to divide his kingdom up among them. And Herod the Great managed to assassinate his brothers so that he became the ruler of Israel, and the Romans let him get away with this. He collaborated with the Romans as well, and perhaps his biggest claim to fame is that when Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were fighting each other, this is Mark Antony and Cleopatra fame, they were fighting each other, and Herod aligned himself with Mark Antony. And so he was on the wrong side of the battle. And so what he did is, after Mark Antony had been killed by Julius Caesar, he went to Rome. And he surrendered himself to Julius Caesar. And he said to Julius Caesar that I am a loyal soldier. And he says, the same loyalty with which I showed to Mark Antony, I will show to you. And Julius Caesar was so impressed by this that he allowed Herod to remain in control of Israel. Now, at the time that we read about Herod the Great in this scripture, he is an old man. He is just a year or so away from dying. He is certifiably insane. He is a crazy man. He has 3 or 4 wives, and he has killed all of them because he thinks that they are plotting to take his power. He's had numerous children, and he has assassinated or killed almost all of his children. In fact, there was a Roman proverb that was going around at the time that it was better to be a pig in Herod's court than it was to be one of his sons, because you had a longer life expectancy. And so he killed all of his rivals. He was convinced that somebody was trying to steal his kingdom. And so he is desperately clutching and hanging on to power. Now, with that in mind, that's King Herod, this crazy guy. And so all of a sudden you have these Magi who show up in Jerusalem. And what is it they're asking for? Where is the King of the Jews? A rival to Herod's kingdom. Well, Herod is shaking. He is trembling. He's convinced that this must be another plot to undermine his rule and his authority. And so when the scriptures tell us that Herod was shaking and all of Jerusalem with him, it's because all of Jerusalem was terrified because they don't know what Herod's going to do. I mean, they're expecting that he's going to go on a rampage and start killing everybody again. In fact, one of the last things that Herod did, and he wasn't able to fulfill it, but this is what he tried to do, is that he knew that when he died, the Jews would celebrate. You know, that would be a day of rejoicing when Herod finally dies. And so he gave orders that on the day that he died, the leading citizens of Jerusalem were to be killed, so that his day of his death would be a day of national mourning and not a day of national celebration. And on the day he died, they were rounded up, but they were not killed. And people did rejoice that Herod was dead. He was not a nice man. He was despised. But he did build a wonderful temple, by the way. And so this was Herod. Now the second group of kings are the Magi. And we have really no idea who and what these guys really were. They're simply called Magi, and our scriptures are frequently called wise men. Wise men does not mean that they were particularly, geniuses or something like that. Most likely what it means is that they were advisors to kings, counselors, which is why, we think why they get the term as a wise men. They were actually counselors, and they were probably, and why we think they were kings, is they weren't really kings, they were advisors to kings. And as to where they're from, we're really not sure where they're from. There are various theories as to where they may have come from. Some think that they came from Arabia, down in the south, and that then they came up and came on around. And so if they were Arabian, and the reason why they think they might be Arabian is this is where you find gold is down in that area, and also where you would find frankincense. So because of some of the treasures that they brought, they thought that might be the location that they were from. And if they were Arabians, In which case, when they arrived, they wouldn't have been riding camels. They'd have been riding what? Yeah, Arabian horses. And they probably would not have been coming, just 2 or 3 of them. They would have brought a cavalry with them. And so that would have been rather interesting to have this cavalry of Arabian horses coming into Jerusalem. And that might have scared people as well, as all of a sudden here's this mobile army that is showing up. Most scholars seem to think now, though, as to where these kings came from would be Babylon. And the reason why they think they might have come from Babylon is that their title of being called Magi. And in the book of Daniel in the lion's den, one of Daniel's titles is he is called the chief of the Magi. One of his titles, chief of the Magi. And what the speculation is that Daniel had a group of men that he began to train in order to look for the signs for the coming of the Messiah. And if that's the case, then what these Magi were is they were astronomers who were studying the heavens, the skies. They were looking for a sign for the coming of the Messiah, and they were trained so that when they saw something in the sky, it led them to make this incredible journey of over 1,000 miles to go to Jerusalem. Now, there's lots of speculation then as to what exactly did the Magi see? What was this Star of Bethlehem that we call it? Now, some think that the Star of Bethlehem was a comet or a supernova or something along those particular lines. And it probably was not a comet, because comets in those days were usually seen as omens of doom rather than good things. Probably wasn't a meteor, because meteors were seen as omens of doom as well. And if it was a supernova, that is something that would have been recorded, in various places, because that's something that's so spectacular in the night sky that various astronomers would have noted it. In all likelihood, what they saw was a wandering star. What a wandering star is a planet. And they were not able to distinguish between what's a star and what's a planet. I mean, for them, when they look in the sky, it's just, that's just what they see. And what we need to realize is they didn't have television. And so what do you do at night for entertainment? You look at the stars. And in that particular climate, at least during the summertime, most people sleep outside on the roof of their house. And what do you do before you fall asleep? You look at the stars. And there's no light pollution, and so the stars are incredibly, incredibly bright. And so everybody knows the stars. Everybody knows the constellations. And so when these wise men show up in Jerusalem and they say that we have seen his star, one of the clues that we get is that Herod doesn't know what they're talking about. What star? What are you seeing? Because everybody would have known what the stars were. And so evidently what they saw was not something that was spectacular like a comet or a supernova or something like that. It was something that was common, but they didn't interpret. Well, there's a professor at Texas A&M, and his name skips my mind right now, but he has made star maps, which go back, a couple thousand years. And he was searching for the Star of Bethlehem, because he thought that if the Star of Bethlehem is real, then there really ought to be scientific evidence that we can see this thing. And there's a guy by the name of Kepler, who was the one who invented, or didn't invent, but he's the one who discovered how planets and stars move, and that they move through space, and it's how we can make star maps. And Kepler originally came up with his studying of stars in order that he could find the Star of Bethlehem. And it took him several years to make his star map, to see where stars were several thousand years ago. And he had the wrong date for when Herod died. So his star map didn't make any sense. And so this guy from Texas A&M, he has figured out that Herod actually died 2 years later than what we think he did. And so he made a different star map, and he found that Jupiter, which was called a wandering star and called the king's star, did some amazing things in 4 BC. That it rose from the east, just like the scripture said. We saw its star from its rising, and all stars rise in the east. That we watched it move from east to west, and it went into a retrograde orbit twice. And what a retrograde orbit is when the Earth starts to, from our perspective, the Earth is moving faster than what Jupiter is, and so it seems as though Jupiter is moving backwards in the sky. And so Jupiter made a loop in the sky 2 times around the sun, the king star, Sol. And so that would have been extremely unusual. In fact, scientists have said that for Jupiter to go into a retrograde orbit twice only happens once every 10,000 years. So it's only happened once in recorded when people would have been able to observe it. That would have gotten the attention of the Magi. That's when they suspect that Jesus was born. These Magi then make plans, travel to Jerusalem because of their training from Daniel. As they make their journey, it takes them 9 months to a year to get their supplies, to make the journey to get to Jerusalem. When they get to Jerusalem, they've been watching this Jupiter as it travels across the sky from the east to the west. They arrive in Jerusalem and they tell Herod what they had seen and that they think that this portends the birth of the Messiah. Herod has no clue because he wasn't looking for that type of a sign, that type of a star. And so he has his wise men, the scribes and the priests, ask him what's going on. And they say, well, there is the prophecy in Micah that tells us that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. And so we need to go to Bethlehem and see if anything happened. And then we find that what Herod does is that he brings the wise men in secretly, has a powwow with them, and he wants to ascertain when did they see the star. And from there is when he finds out that it had happened about a year or 2 prior to that, which is why when he kills the babies, he takes 2 years old and younger. All along, Herod is planning, of course, to kill this rival. And so the wise men, they make their way, and at this particular time, this professor at Texas A&M, according to his star map, on December the 24th, 2 BC, Jupiter went into a retrograde orbit again, so that standing in Jerusalem, it would appear as though Jupiter moves from north to south and stops directly over Bethlehem. And so we are told that the kings did what? They rejoiced exceedingly. And then when they arrive in Bethlehem, what do they find? They went to Jerusalem expecting to find a king. So, of course, you're going to go to a palace. And instead, they go to Bethlehem. They go to a home. We know that this has been at least a year or 2 later because Joseph and Mary are living in a house. They're not living in the manger anymore. They're in a house. And when these wise men, they go to the house, and it's a house of a poor family, it's a credit to their faith that they went in. And they worshiped. Now, Middle Eastern, Persian, Iranian, Iraqian worship would not have been quiet. They would have had drums. They would have had cymbals. They would have had horns and flutes. And it would have been exuberant. It would have been noisy. And so you'd have had this concert that would have broken out. Now, Bethlehem's only a town in Jesus' day. They think it was a town of anywhere from 300 to 600 people. So it was tiny. So could you imagine having this entourage that shows up and this party breaks out with the cymbals and the drums and all of this noise? And so everybody would have known that something was going on. And then they present their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And then being warned in a dream, they go back a different way because they know that Herod probably would kill them, to cover up what he's about to do. And so you had the contrast of Herod the king, who's insane, and then you have the wise men who are willing to make an incredible journey all of this way in order to find a child who's poor. And it's a credit to their faith that they would go in and that they would worship him and they would offer to him these precious gifts, the best gifts that they could offer of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Our third king, though, is Jesus. And what a contrast he is to the others. These kings traveled, the Magi traveled thousands of miles. As far as we know, Jesus never traveled more than 40 or 50 miles away from where he was born. We know that he went to Sidon, which is about 35 miles away from Nazareth. So that's about as far away as he ever traveled. Herod had armies. The other kings, the Magi, they had an entourage, probably an armed entourage with them. Jesus had 12 disciples, and they had no weapons. Jesus didn't write any books. He didn't raise an army. He didn't do any of the things that you would expect kings to do. In fact, he was very humble. Herod built palaces. Jesus, as far as we know, didn't build anything that was lasting. Ironic for a carpenter, right? That he built something and nothing of it lasted that we have seen. And yet, what did he build? He built his church. This humble carpenter who was born to humble parents in a stable in Bethlehem became the King of Kings. Never raised an army, never raised a lot of money, never did any of that sort of a thing, but his influence on the world far exceeds that of Herod the Great, far exceeds that of the Magi, far exceeds what any ruler has ever done, because he changed lives by dying on the cross and rising again from the dead. Most of us do not identify with Herod the Great. But if we really examine our hearts, how often do we mask our cruelty and jealousy with a smile? Say nasty things about somebody that we're jealous about. We don't have the resources to kill people, but how many of you have wanted to kill somebody? Maybe it was your husband or something like that. But we get angry and upset with things, and we want to be able to manipulate and have the power to do things to them. But sometimes we're a lot closer to Herod the Great than we think. Herod the Great was grasping for immortality, and so he built things, monuments to himself. How many times do we look to build monuments to ourselves, hoping that somebody will remember us? The Magi. Most of us probably don't identify with the Magi, but the thing that I find most interesting about them is that they had the faith to travel thousands of miles to go and to see Jesus and then to worship him. We can be like the Magi in that we can worship Jesus, and we can offer to him the best gift that we have. And our gift isn't gold and frankincense and myrrh. It's our own hearts. Because the King of Kings still lives. He was born in Bethlehem. It's a historical thing. I think the Star of Bethlehem was historical. I think it can be traced. I think it actually happened in time. And what it demonstrates is that God was in control of the entire universe, so that he knew stars, which are moving across the skies and have been moving across the skies, according to Carl Sagan, billions and billions and billions of years, that God planned it so that on that particular time, Jupiter did its thing, went across the skies, and that was when Jesus was born, and it was a sign to the Magi to go to worship. Can we see the signs around us? The signs of people's love, coming to church, to see the sign that Jesus wants to be born into our lives, into our hearts, that we might come and worship him. Which king do you want to be like? I want to be like the Magi. and I want to worship the King of Kings. On that night, when Jesus was betrayed, jumping about 30-some years ahead, he gave his life rather than trying to clutch and to hang on to his life as Herod the Great did. So he took the bread at that last meal that he had with his disciples, and he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, which is given for you for the forgiveness of your sins. Take and eat in remembrance of me." Then likewise after the supper, he took the cup. He said that this is the cup of my blood that is shed for you for the forgiveness of your sins. Take and drink in remembrance of me.